Thank you for joining us for this episode of TheoDisc, a place for discussing theology and growing in our faith. Today I'm joined by Dr. Steve Watts. Steve received his PhD in medieval history at the University of St Andrews and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto. He graduated from Regent in 2010 with an MCS in Interdisciplinary Studies. And now he is Assistant Professor of History and Dean of the Chapel at Crandall University, Moncton, and is the Primary History Distance Education Instructor for Regent College, Vancouver. Steve also teaches church history and spirituality at WTC. In our conversation, Steve and I explored the value of humility when evaluating the history of those who've gone before us in the faith, and how being aware of our own cultural biases can keep us from making sweeping generalizations about the past. Get ready for a historical, theological deep dive. And if you'd like to send us any feedback, then email podcast@wtctheology.org.uk. Enjoy. Steve Watts, it's great to have you on the TheoDisc Podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
So, I thought we'd just begin by talking a little bit about your PhDs in medieval history. At WTC,
Right.
you teach the history of Christian spirituality. Could you just tell us a little bit about kind of what that entails and what your expertise is?
So at WTC, right, I've got the history of Christian spirituality, and I also teach a class of classics of early Christian literature. And both of those courses come out of a passion for sharing the great historical legacy of our faith, the way that God works amongst the faithful, and just the great many lessons and examples that we can draw from, that we can learn from. And that stems from my interests in church history academically, and specifically my PhD at St Andrews was looking at early 13th century, that's early 1200s, medieval religious culture, and seeing the really dynamic way that they sought to fulfill the obligations of the gospel and sought to follow Jesus in ways that, to be honest, prior to getting into my graduate and then into my doctoral studies, I just didn't know existed. And so I suppose that part of what I love doing at WTC and other places is to share a bit of that excitement, a bit of that journey, where I can kind of hopefully encourage other people also to realize that there's so much there to explore, so much there to learn, so much there to take inspiration from.
Brilliant. I think certainly that's been my experience even as a student at WTC, is this kind of discovery of what's come before. And the riches that are there, and we're going to kind of come at this conversation from a perspective of examining the posture that we take when we look back historically at different figures and events, important events, and how sometimes we might need to readjust our judgment of those periods and our assessment of those. But before we get into that conversation, I would want to just ask you a few questions just so we can get to know you a little bit. All of our first time guests are put through this ringer. So we're just talking here about things that you return to, things that are comforts for you, things that are kind of constants in your life. So the first one is, what's a book that you return to?
Man, that's a very good question. The first thing that comes to mind, actually, maybe doesn't sound especially comforting, but it is something that I do return to, in part because I think it re-energizes the way that I think, it challenges the way that I think, and that is the fiction of one of the Inklings, Charles Williams, not C.S. Lewis, not Tolkien, both of whom are obviously are wonderful authors, but Charles Williams, the way in which he sees the world, the way in which he kind of imagines the interactions between the material and the spirit worlds, and the way in which we can kind of participate in something much more profound, even among the seemingly mundane. So I think that's something that I would go to. I think perhaps not necessarily as a source of comfort, as a way of re-energizing, reframing the way I'm seeing the world, seeing the the things that I do in the day to day.
Brilliant. And what's a kind of food or a meal that you might return to?
Gosh. Well, I mean, you have to start thinking about your mother's cooking, really. I mean, by your mother's, I think mine rather than yours. I'm sure your mother is a wonderful cook. But for me, I still have such fond memories of my mother's lasagna, which I just would eat plates and plates of lasagna when I was in my late teens and early 20s. And so I think that even if I don't get access to that all that much these days, just even the thought of it brings me to my happy place.
You've not gotten a recipe so you can make it yourself now.
No, I have a feeling that might spoil it.
Yeah, it's a special mother's touch.
Yeah.
What about a place that you return to?
Gosh, I love being by the water. I love being by the beach. We are relatively close to the beach where I am in Moncton, New Brunswick, where I work at Crandall University. And so I guess 20 minutes or so I can get out to the beach. But honestly, going back to the place where I did my graduate and doctoral studies at St. Andrews, and by virtue of being able to come back to the UK, whether at WTC or what have you, I do try and make it up there at least once a year under non-COVID restrictions. And just being able to walk along, East Sands, West Sands, Castle Sands is just really good food for my soul.
That's great. Yeah, the idea of the Scottish beach is somewhat different to the idea of beaches in other places.
That's right, and I'm not just saying that to get me good graces, Kenny. It's it comes from the heart. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's dive into the conversation we're going to have today about how our knowledge of history can affect sometimes our perspective on it. And
yeah,
how would you assess the current situation, at least as we're talking about the Western Evangelical Church, the situation in regards to our knowledge of church history?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say it was in a healthy place, but I tend to think it isn't. I think that most Christians, though, that I've encountered, though deeply faithful, they have very little memory of the past. They have very little memory, really, even going back before their parents' generation, to be honest. And I should really emphasize here that this isn't something that I would hold anybody at fault for. I mean, I come from a Pentecostal tradition originally, and the Pentecostal way of doing history is you have the first century and you have the Jerusalem church, and then things all kind of go wrong after that. And then wonderfully in the early 20th century, you have Azusa Street and charismatic, Pentecostal revival and people speaking in tongues, which of course, as everybody knows, is the evidence of salvation. And that's the way you do history, right? And then you have this whole kind of almost 2,000 years, or at least 900 years that falls between that, which, God apparently kind of just took his hands off the wheel for a while. So it's quite interesting theology. But so I completely sympathize with people who have a limited knowledge of church history. It's not typically something that especially evangelical churches have a lot of time for. But I would add that I don't think that that's just necessarily a Christian phenomenon. I think that that's something that we have inherited from our wider culture. And what I mean by that is that we are in the midst of the digital revolution, where the major drivers of culture are digital, are software-based, are tech-based. All the news about things like Twitter, for example, Elon Musk, Instagram, Meta, all of these different factors, how online we all are. And we need to think about the implicit judgment or implicit value systems. They're inherent, right? They're implicit within these companies, within this mindset, which is that the new is better. The past is inherently worse. And underwriting all of that is this notion, if we just work harder, if we use our brains a bit more effectively, we are going to improve, we are going to evolve, we are going to evolve. And whether we are explicit about it or not, the implication, the very strong implication, is that what has come before is either something we don't really need to know about, or is something that's inherently bad, something that we should either just discard or in some cases renounce. And so I think that in many respects, evangelical culture has been informed by these larger waves, or maybe not waves, should I say, this tide within the wider culture that we find ourselves in. So again, I'm not blaming anybody, but I think it's important for us to identify the setting that we find ourselves in, and the larger culture that seems to inform that setting.
Yeah, and it's complex in some ways. I think we are in a cultural moment of kind of reassessment of some of the historical narratives that we've understood, and in many ways that's a fruitful exercise to think rightly about things. But you're right, there is this temptation towards almost dismissing or discarding everything about the past. And I think in a religious, or particularly a Christian context, certainly my experience has been that actually not engaging with church history is seen to be almost a virtuous shedding of something that's a stale and deathly expression of the faith. Have you kind of come across that?
Yes, I have, though I actually think that that's changing. And I've certainly seen that changing at WTC. I've seen that changing in the teaching I've been doing at Regent College in Vancouver, where I'm the distance ed instructor for their core history courses, and actually designing a course for them for January on the medieval church and Francis. So I actually have found that there's, in some respects, a greater hunger in some pockets. But I think more generally, if I'm thinking back to maybe certain pastors or certain environments that I've grown up in, that what limited knowledge people have of the past is typically quite negative. And there's a kind of rhetorical contrast involved, which is what happened in the past. The little that I know that it's bad, and thank goodness, thank God, perhaps, that I'm not like that. And I do want to get back to the observation that you made about our particular historical moment. And one thinks, for instance, of the statues coming down, or particularly of those people who are seen to be complicit with the transatlantic slave trade, or even closer to home from a Canadian point of view, thinking about people who are complicit with the horrors that occurred within the residential school system, for example. I mean, there are others besides. And I think there's an element of that, of course, which is incredibly helpful, not least for the people who have really suffered as a result of some of those injustices. I suppose the one qualification that I would add to that is that I am not quite sure that even as there's a somewhat of an investigation into the past, my experience is that itself has not been very rigorous. And which is to say that, yes, let me put it this way. My sense, by reading the news, reading articles, talking to people, is that a number of the statues that have been up in public places that people actually didn't know very much about, they typically didn't think about it one way or another. And that's not just people who are Caucasian, it's people of color too. And what's happened is that people have pointed out who these people are, who these statues represent. And people go, well, of course, this is not something that we want. But it struck me that there's an irony there, is that it comes from a place of ignorance, and then you get a little bit of information about who they are, and then you get rid of that past. And so it doesn't end up really becoming an opportunity to learn, I don't think. And in many respects, you lose that opportunity to think more carefully and deeply about the complexity. And that's not to excuse the behavior of the past, but think about the complexity of what was going on back then. But also you lose the opportunity, and I think this is something that we're going to get to then reflect more critically about our own present moment, and perhaps the ways in which we can be complicit in things like slavery, because even though transatlantic slave trade is is no longer in existence. Human trafficking most certainly is. And indeed, the kind of systemic economic injustices still are present. And so I think that, we need to be careful, and hopefully we'll get into this in greater detail in our conversation, but we do need to be careful that when we are actually engaging in the historical past, we do so in a way that is thoughtful, that it's engaging in a way that does, on one hand, absolutely shine a light on prior injustice, but doesn't do so in a way that actually precludes opportunity to truly learn from it, and indeed kind of shine a light on injustices in our own present time, in our own particular circumstances.
Yeah, our present is the history of the future, which sounds like a complex statement, but yeah, someday somebody's going to be looking back at our time.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's interesting if we think about, particularly in a church history or theological sense, what little we do know sometimes about the history of the church can lead us into this desire to disassociate ourselves from troubling incidences that we hear about, or troubling theology.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if we can kind of get into this discussion about how do we have a healthy perspective while maintaining a posture of humility that you've already spoken about.
Yeah, absolutely. I just reflecting even on conversations that I've had with students at WTC over the years, and some of whom, and this is almost a direct quote, had been raised or grown up in a Christian environment, or even in a non-Christian environment, with this deep-rooted sense that they must live in shame, or live ashamed of their Christian past. That their Christian past is inherently something that needs to be apologized for, or repented of, or somehow cast off. And I think that gets reinforced, for example, when people might bring up something like the Crusades or the Inquisition, or perhaps more immediately, the legacy of missionary activity in the 19th century. And I think that I'm not sure exactly what it's like in the UK, but certainly in Canada, Christian activity of any stripe within the public sphere historically has always been treated as something we just don't want to do again. There's all kinds of aspersions cast upon it. And so, I understand why people would want to either ignore that past, or apologize for that past, or try to distinguish themselves or disassociate themselves from that past. I totally understand it. Now, my response to that in general terms is twofold, outside of sympathizing. The first is often that what you think you're apologizing for, or these particular things within our past which are perhaps uncomfortable or problematic, often comes from a place of, quite frankly, ignorance, which is, and I'm trying to not say that too negatively, but it's often that we just don't know very much about what we're talking about. They stand for something, they signify something, but as it turns out, the people who might even bring them up as a kind of an example of the abuses of Christianity, those people probably have very little idea about what they're talking about. And the Christians who are apologizing for them often don't know very much about what they're talking about. And it doesn't mean to say that there aren't things within our past that are worth repenting over. But what people will discover if they start doing the work is actually, again, that these things like even the Inquisition, or various Inquisitions, or indeed the Crusades, once you actually get into the scholarship, and I'm saying kind of non-Christian scholarship, you recognize that things are not nearly as black and white, that they often arise out of historical circumstances that are quite foreign to us, that they arise within societies and cultures that have very different value systems than us. And at a certain point, we then need to be really careful that we are not holding them to a set of value systems which are entirely foreign to them, right? Which is quite unjust. In fact, if you're not careful, and I use this language guardedly, but if we're not careful, we can kind of colonize our past, imposing our sets of values upon the past without actually bothering to understand who they are, the actors within the past, what motivated them and the circumstances that they find themselves in. So that's one response. A second one is, I think, one that I think most Christians could probably identify with quite easily without getting into the historical weeds, is to remember our scriptures. Remember, especially the Jewish scriptures, remember the patriarchs. How many of these patriarchs, right, of our Abrahams, our Isaacs, our Josephs, what have you, Jacobs, how many of those are going to escape this kind of historical cancellation, if we think about it, right? They're all problematic, aren't they? And yet, right, they are in our scriptures, and yet they are there as testaments to God's ongoing faithfulness. And sometimes they do well, sometimes they do horrifically badly. Of course, David being kind of a classic example of a real kind of mixed bag, and yet they're part of our story. And I think we need to be really careful about doing something, perhaps as a way of maybe sanitizing the Christian witness, that God himself did not choose to do when telling the story of our salvation. And I think we really need to take that seriously. Don't sanitize what God himself has not sanitized. Now let's give because I'm a historian, let me give you an example of something that I think of a number of historical instances or historical persons that I think that people get in the habit of apologizing for, or are kind of conditioned to think badly of, often without kind of further exploration into who and the what and the why and all those kind of wonderful questions that historians are in the habit, or should be in the habit, of asking. And for me, one of my favorites is Constantine, right? This is the emperor who converted in one way or another to Christianity due to a vision and then a victory against all odds in 312 AD. And I have found, speaking of social media and all its wonders, I have found a tendency for certain North American theologians or popular pastors to look at this or communicate this to their many followers as being, this is being almost kind of the second fall, right, of man, right? You have Adam and Eve, and then you have, oh no, Constantine, and here we've come this unholy marriage between church and state. Yeah. And often what they're doing is they're trying to communicate this as a way of trying to explain why they don't like Trump, why they don't like Republican Party's alignment, right, with the religious right or with evangelical conservatives. And you see all kinds of things, especially with the elections, midterm elections, or presidential elections coming up later on. Just this critiques Christian nationalism and these kinds of things, and so they identify Constantine as this is the reason, okay. And so Constantine, bad guy, don't know what happened there, probably even doubt legitimacy of his conversion, but that's the kind of beginning of the end with this kind of the rise of Christendom. Now, quite frankly, as a historian, I think that narrative is rubbish. Why do I think it's rubbish? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, the methodology is wrong. You shouldn't be using the past, especially the past that's 1,700 years old, to justify your political or even theological views in the present. That's 1,700 years. That's an enormous amount of time, right? To say that one thing causes something, 1,700 years ago now causes something in your present is bankrupt methodologically, right? I mean, it's crazy junk. Secondly, it misunderstands the situation of Christians on the very eve of Constantine's conversion. And this is something that I try and communicate to WTC students. You need to imagine, you need to try and put yourselves in an environment, especially in the East, which is at that stage in the early 300s, where Christianity is it's at its perhaps say most sophisticated, certainly most numerous within the Roman Empire. When I say the East here, I mean present-day Greece or present-day Turkey, especially around the coasts. That right before the point, or pretty much right before the point of Constantine's conversion and his victory, they are undergoing the greatest persecution the church has ever experienced. And, even at a very conservative estimate, we're thinking of a number of thousand Christians, leaders of the church who are getting killed, some of them burned alive. Really, really horrible. This is called the Great Persecution under Diocletian, under Galerius in the early 300s. The idea, the very concept that somehow this empire that's trying to eradicate Christianity from the face of the earth can, in a moment, it seems, turn to the one that they had crucified centuries earlier is astonishing. And not only astonishing, but can hardly be interpreted as anything but God's kind of great providential saving work, right? That's the first thing. We really need to put ourselves in this situation, whatever the legacy might end up being down the way, okay?
Yep. That
we really need to think that this is a church that just feels like literally all hell is breaking loose. And then how is it that against all odds, this emperor in the West, or this acclaimed emperor in the West, Constantine, sees a vision that signifies, that is interpreted to him as being Christ and kind of leads him into this victory? How can this be interpreted as anything else by contemporaries as being a great work of God, right? Saving us, right? As being the dawn, just at the darkest point of night, okay? So that's a way of thinking about the circumstances. Then what about the setting? Then what about Constantine himself? Well, the evidence of Constantine, what we can gather from someone like Constantine is that he seems to, on one hand, kind of understood a bit more about what Christianity is as he went along, and that you can see a kind of progressive kind of development, perhaps even evolution, with respect to how candid he was willing to make, or even exclusive, I suppose you'd say, he was willing to make his Christian claims appear. But his particular perspective, his particular strategy was never to make Christianity the official religion. That was certainly not the case. And in fact, that was a development that happened generations afterwards. And not only that, but his point was to try and be as, shall we say, ecumenical as possible with various religious groups, shall we say, broadly speaking, within the empire. And why was that? Because the army was largely pagan, and so was the very wealthy aristocracy. And so even as he aligned himself with Christianity, which was still at that stage a relatively small percentage of the population, he was having to learn to negotiate, which is actually a place that most people in Christian authority find themselves, especially in late antiquity and then into the Middle Ages. And what we end up finding is not only is he trying to be relatively ecumenical, but he is also trying to ensure that the church that he is trying to patronize, or at least trying to encourage themselves, develop some kind of coherent unity, but also that he is attempting to try and develop lines of communication with the churches such as they are growing. And so what we end up discovering, at least, and this is, I'm representing here the kind of general historical consensus here by, scholars in the field, is that you don't get a kind of top-down, the state telling the church what to do. On the other hand, by contrast, actually, what you find is increasingly you're finding Christian emperors who are going to bishops to try and get a sense of what the Christian people want. So to put it in the words of the great historian of the period, Peter Brown, this is emperors who are finding themselves leading by the rear, or leading from the rear, which is to say, they are leaning on the bishops to tell them what the church population would like to see happen, right? What is important to them. So again, rather than it being top down, what you're finding is that Christian emperors are often following the lead of bishops and their constituents, right? And so, I mean, look, there's a lot more to unpack there, but already I hope you're getting a sense that there's this kind of the notion of an unholy relationship between church and state, particularly one which, the emperor becomes Christian and therefore, right, the church feels like it needs to fall in line or therefore becomes corrupted by imperial authority. Well, in many respects, the opposite is true. That you end up finding the emperor kind of following the lead of the bishops, and the emperors also making sure that they are kind of having to negotiate quite carefully or to try and traverse the political and quite mixed and varied religious landscape, that they have to kind of watch their step there, and that they're quite like Constantine and others after him, that they do have to watch their steps. They need to be aware of what they're doing, and they need to make sure that they're talking to people who are really in the know, which quite frankly sounds a lot more like what politics actually looks like, rather than what we might imagine occurring 1700 years ago. So, I mean, there's lots more that I could say, but I think that's probably enough in terms of kind of complicating the narrative for the moment. And I hope, Kenny, that you were able to follow that. I'm not sure.
No, I am, and it's interesting because as you talk and unpack even more, you do get this complex interweb of relationships that are going on.
Yeah.
I loved how you kind of connected that earlier on to our view of the scriptures as well, because sometimes I think we feel like we have this overbearing need to have the heroes and the villains. I think sometimes we read the scriptures that way, and actually if you close read them, you get a much more complex picture of humanity trying to follow God and God trying to woo humanity. Perhaps our view of history needs to shift that way as well, where we're less about trying to identify the heroes and villains and more looking at the perspective of each situation, the complexities of what's going on.
Yeah, and seeking, to align ourselves with the heroes, which is kind of implicitly what happens. And I mean, I'm just struck, even as you were talking there, even with respect to the New Testament, right? And, you have Peter, right? Mm-hmm. The rock upon whom Jesus builds his church. And, is there a more complicated, problematic, and at times pathetic figure in all the New Testament, right? I mean, we really need to take that seriously.
Yeah.
And not least because, as tradition holds it, that Peter's the authority behind the Gospel of Mark, the apostolic authority behind the Gospel of Mark. And Peter does not come out well in the Gospel of Mark. No. And that's got to be intentional, right? Where Peter's not trying to, again, sanitize his past, right? It's almost like same thing with Paul. Paul's the same way. We really need to take this stuff seriously. They are not sanitizing their past. And in many respects, actually, they will emphasize the ways they have gotten things wrong as a way of articulating further just how important God's work is. Not just going forward, but through that past.
Yep.
And, I think of Augustine, similar, his Confessions, right? Incredible work. This is Augustine, right? And he's writing at the end of the 4th century into the early 5th, right? So late 300s, early 400s. And this is a leading light of, Western theology, writing in North Africa. And he writes, he is someone who reaches the very top of his professional life prior to becoming a Christian, professor of rhetoric in Milan, like really kind of climbed the very top, realized that it wasn't all it cracked up to be, was still restless, had not yet found the Lord properly in whom he would find his rest. And he comes back to North Africa, he becomes a pastor, and he writes his confessions, a confession of faith, but it's also a confession of sin. And if you read through, especially those early books, the confessions, it's all about how he constantly got things wrong. And it's not because he saw himself as the hero of the story, it's because God was the hero of the story. Yeah. And all the ways that he got things wrong in the past was an illustration that yet God is faithful, yet God is gracious. And these lessons that he learned, even his fallibility, were just that. They were things that could be learned and things that he could teach others, that they could learn from his experience, not because he was great, but because God was, and God was greater. I think this is really powerful, that we do not teach the history in such a way that's sanitized or to make an argument for one denomination over another, which has traditionally happened, especially in a denominational framework. But we see that in the past there is that great learning opportunity in both respects, which it is something that we can be inspired by, but as we can also learn from with respect to the ways that we don't want to go, the kinds of things that we don't want to repeat. But I think the beauty of it, especially within the Christian, with that kind of truly faithful legacy of certain people that I've talked about there, is that often what can be most inspiring is learning from their mistakes, right? Not just that we can repent about it, but actually go, nevertheless, God was faithful, and nevertheless, God still worked from them. And actually part of the power of our testimony is to talk about the ways in which we are broken, and yet God has saved us, and even use that brokenness and that weakness for his glory.
Yeah. Well, as we kind of wrap up the conversation here, maybe we can just finish by talking a little bit about, if we take this seriously, this engagement with the story of our Christian past, how can that provide opportunities for us to become more self-aware? To maybe lead us into those places of repentance and actually to become more effective witnesses in the world in which we live?
So one of the things that I try and teach my students, what I try to encourage them, is that to learn about the past well is about asking really good questions, not jumping to conclusions, not assuming that you already know what's going on. Ask really good questions and then listen really carefully. And why is that important? Well, it's important because in all ways of life, if you want to learn about anybody, right, so much of it is to ask good questions, so much of it is to really listen, not to jump to conclusions. It's especially true when we're talking to somebody from a different culture with a different value system, right? We're not just going to jump to conclusions about somebody from a different ethnicity, right? I hope we don't. Mm-hmm. We want to ask good questions. We want to learn about what motivates them. We want to learn about their values, about their histories, right? This is the way we genuinely get to know who they are. And then, of course, we listen really carefully. And so we do this with the past, right? We don't assume otherwise. And that's the way that we learn, right? We try and understand motivations, complexities, not just so they stay complex, but we can actually develop a real appreciation for what's going on. Now, that shouldn't lead us then to a kind of live and let live, kind of perspective, one where we don't come to a kind of judgment. Mm-hmm. What ends up meaning actually is when we do come to evaluate it, and I sincerely believe that we ought to have some kind of evaluation, even as we evaluate other people, right? Is this person honest, or is this person to be faithful? Is this person someone that shares the same values as me? We do it in such a way, though, that really that takes seriously their integrity as people made in God's image, right? That we have done the work to understand them, which then means that even our disagreements are then actually deeply informed agreements that take seriously their integrity as images of God. And that involves, right, humility. That involves not putting myself first. That means not jumping, that's not a rush of judgment, or that's not just looking at them or asking questions in a way that validates my own particular value systems or the things that are important to me, okay? Yeah. Validates what it means for me to be a Canadian, or indeed even a Christian, or indeed a charismatic evangelical, or what have you, okay? It involves a level of humility. Now, that humility, that level of self-sacrifice, that practice of asking good questions of the past and of listening carefully, I believe then is really, really helpful for us in the present, which is getting to answering the question that you asked. Because I think that when you start asking good questions of the past and listening carefully, you see the ways in which Christians, for instance, in the past, in church history, you can see how they are informed by the historical circumstances. You can see the way they're informed by their social horizons. You can see the way that they are informed by the cultures in which they participate. And when you start doing that, when you get in the habit of doing that and seeing the way that these various conditions inform their faith, and see the ways in which their faith then tries to inform the environment around them, you start getting the habit of mind, you start creating the kind of critical distance to go, hold on, hang on, what are the things in my life that are informing my faith?
Yeah.
What are the elements within my culture and my society that are, to quote a beloved old professor of mine, Bruce Hindmarsh, he says that are written in letters too big to read, which is to say, what are the things in our society that so deeply inform us that are written so big that we would never think to articulate it? And it's not actually until somebody comes from a different culture that goes, hang on, why do you do this? Or until we go to a different culture and see them do something differently that we go, oh, wait a second, why do we do this? Why does our Christian practice look this way? Why do we read our scriptures this way and not another way? Why do we spiritualize this bit and not another bit, right? Why have we gotten to these habits of thought, these habits of mind, when other people don't do it this way? What does that then kind of promote in us or provoke in us? And I do hope it raises the sensitivity to actually, rather than just criticizing what people called for crusades and what was a heavily militarized society where being a knight was a vocation, a legitimate vocation within the Middle Ages, right? Rather than kind of critiquing this apparent, unity of church and state, whether it's, in medieval Christendom or whatever Constantine's going on about, we start going, well, hold on. How do our notions about political life inform the way that we approach who God is? How has, our particular secular worldview interiorized, our, especially British sensibilities about the relationship between Christianity and public life, right? Mm. How much have we kind of implicitly taken as fact or as a truth that we really need to keep our Christianity in a box and never let it come out in the House of Commons, How have we somehow internalized that? Despite the fact that if you look to the early 19th century, the amazing things that British evangelicals got accomplished within political life in the early 19th century was precisely because Wilberforce was encouraged by Newton to, God has put you where he's put you. You need to be faithful to him in political life. Same thing with Lord Shaftesbury. Being a Christian doesn't mean then kind of getting in your holy huddle or try not to embarrass yourself in public life. It means actually do get embarrassed. Do be faithful to God's call, but somehow or another we've internalized this sense that, whatever you do, don't bring up the faith in public life. Whatever you do, don't bring up the faith within political life. And unfortunately, what you end up doing is you end up kind of getting to something like you're finding in the States, where often faith is now kind of being communicated in the public sphere in a way that's really unhealthy. So anyways, it creates these kinds of troubles. But I'm getting on a tangent. But the gist of it is, coming back to your initial question, by looking at the past, we get a sense, we can build a kind of critical distance where we can look at our present and go, hold on, how are the larger conditions with our culture informing our faith? And now with that critical distance, how can we then approach that culture in a way that's active, that's proactive, that's entrepreneurial even, where we recognize that we're no longer kind of passively conforming to the world, but we're actively seeking to change it. And I think one of the things that's really encouraging about learning about the faith, or the faith has been practiced down through the ages, that we can see people doing that kind of work where they recognize the larger forces within their culture and are able to speak into it powerfully because they're no longer just passively going along with the status quo, but they're seeking to change things. And kind of bringing the whole circle, is that in addition to kind of an encouragement, I think that puts us in a really healthy place, which is one, much like Peter finds himself, much like Paul finds himself, much like Augustine finds himself was in a place of humility. That even as we are seeking to change, write history, recognize actually we are not the ones who are doing the writing. This is God's work, and that it's important for us to see ourselves as being useful, but also as being fallible. We're not going to get it right, just as other people haven't got it right. And often, indeed, that God is going to do amazing things, perhaps even more out of our weaknesses than our strengths. And I think as long as we kind of recognize that that the way that God has chosen to work through us in our past is is through humility, through our brokenness. I think perhaps that might even be an encouragement to people, or offer hope to people, because rather than trying to sanitize themselves in the present, or sanitize their past, they are able to see themselves as actually being vessels, albeit broken, but vessels for God's use, that He can transform according to His grace.
That's great. Yeah, each of us has our own problematic personal histories in which God has been faithful and has been at work. I love that, Steve.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective today and giving us lots to really consider, I think, as individuals and as students, how we can better engage with church history. I do hope in the future we'll get a chance again to talk and just kind of learn from your perspective. And but it's been a real treat, a rich conversation, and thank you for being with us.
Yes, of course. Yeah, lovely to chat with you, Kenny.
Cheers, Steve.
Yeah, bye.
Well, thank you, Steve. That has really motivated us to get stuck into some church history. In our next episode, Kenny chats with Bev Murrell, Senior Leader of Christian Growth International and founder of the Courier Network for Women Leaders, about what the leadership landscape will look like in the future. Bev teaches transformational leadership at WTC, and the episode was recorded in between lectures at our residential in Nottingham. TheoDisc is part of WTC, a theological college that seeks to partner with the church through equipping and sending the whole people of God. Our innovative hub model allows you to study on any of our part-time programs without leaving your work or ministry. Come and find out more at wtctheology.org.uk. Thank you for listening to episode 8 of TheoDisc. Join us for episode 9 with the wonderful Bev Murrell, leadership expert extraordinaire. Bye for now.